She is the parish pastor at Trinity Anglican, and she's going to come share, and she'll tell you a little bit more about herself. Her name is Ashley Mathews. Plywood presents Ashley.
Thank you, everybody. My name is Ashley. It is true. I am both a lady and an Anglican priest. Which puts me like right up there with snow leopards or something like that, I suppose, in terms of rare and unusual species. I'm also a preacher, so I would feel right at home if I got lots of amens and come-ons. Just kidding, we're Anglicans, we don't do that. I'll feel right at home if you say nothing. I get to talk about gender equality, actually, which is I'm really thrilled to do because I don't actually, strangely enough, do that very often, and particularly to people like you all. So thank you for being here and for caring, and I'm really honored to have the opportunity. I think the longer I live and the longer I do the work that I do, the more I become convinced that the reason that we need to have nights like tonight, the reason they're so good and so helpful, is because for whatever reason we seem to live in a world where we have a natural tendency towards choosing to dominate and exploit one another rather than to encourage and call out potential in one another. And you know, there are likely a number of very good explanations for why that is the case. And yet, among them, there is this ancient story of sorts, which the longer I live also becomes sort of increasingly relevant for me. And according to this story, it was not always so. That there was this time in the beginning, as they say, brief as it was, where we were liberated from this tendency to dominate and exploit one another. Actually, so the story goes, woman was created out of the side of man, and out of the side, I think probably because she was intended to stand side by side with him as a kind of partner, to join him in the work of calling out and cultivating potential in the rest of all of life and all living things. That was sort of their job together. Every living thing, it was assumed, had a right to flourish. And so the job of man and woman was to defend this right, and they called it justice. But then along the way, something went terribly wrong, and we stopped doing this. And all of a sudden, we started seeing our differences as an opportunity to take advantage of one another, to exploit rather than encourage, to dominate rather than to cultivate. And privilege, which was formerly seen, the privilege really was being endowed with this act of justice. It was the happy privilege to defend justice. That was the privilege of the human. It's what it meant to be human. And then all of a sudden, privilege became its own sort of right. That even if it was not given to you by God, it could be taken. And thus all of our isms were born. Sexism, classism, racism, and they called it sin. So the story goes, right? And whether this story means anything to you or not, I have found it to be true that justice really is all about how you choose to see and to leverage your privilege, your power, the abilities that you have. You will either see your privilege, however great or small, as a right that can be taken, if not given, or as a responsibility that you have towards other people and their flourishing around you. So it's a right, or it's a responsibility. Which is it? You will either choose to do justice, and therefore to cultivate and call out potential in other people around you, or not. And therefore you will choose to, so the story goes, I guess, to sin, right? What I have found to be true in my own life, why this story seems to always captivate my attention and imagination, is because I know it to be true that I would not be who I am as a leader had I not had the good fortune of finding myself in the company of other leaders who believed it to be a responsibility to use their privilege as an opportunity to call out my potential. They saw that as a responsibility that they had. And so they were committed to doing it. And thank God, right, that they were. And so I guess maybe the first question to ask ourselves as would-be egalitarians or egalitarians, as future leaders, those of you who are here are in no doubt leading in some capacity or another, is if we are committed to this thing of equality, in this instance, gender equality, do you have an imagination for how you're going to use your influence, your privilege, actually, to call out potential, to cultivate potential in the people around you? Because if you don't have a sort of impetus, a desire, and an imagination for what that's actually going to look like, it just doesn't happen. We have these conversations and we go home and nothing changes. What are we going to do is the question. If you were to ask any member of any marginalized group of people, they would tell you equality is and has always been about politics. There's no such thing as an apolitical conversation about equality. It just doesn't exist. It's always about politics, right? Because if your principles don't have the power and the ability to shape your policies and inform your practices, they're impotent, which means they're useless. They're not very good principles, actually, after all. If your principles do not have the ability to shape your policies and inform your practices, they are impotent and utterly useless to you, actually. So, how do we take our principles and turn them into policies and practices that effect change, that cultivate potential? That's a question for me now as a leader of an organization, and to all of you, again, in whatever sphere you occupy. So what about policy and what about practice? She's just going to get really terribly practical, y'all. And thinking about what I could say up here, it was like there are a million things to say about gender equality. We could talk about Mount Lauer, and there are lots of things that I do and don't want to say about what happened with Mount Lauer, and all that's happening in the news around us. And yet for me, I know it's like what people chose to do tangibly and practically in my life and for my benefit that made all the difference. It was policies and practices. So, in terms of policy, for example, are you willing to be a part of and to hopefully have the ability or opportunity to lead an organization in which you are willing, for the sake of gender equality, to ensure paid time off, paid time leave for men and women in your organization? How you answer that question is an issue of justice. Are you willing to work for flexible work schedules for men and for women? Are you willing to pay young mothers the same rate that you would be willing to pay young fathers? Because statistically speaking, she's far more likely to choose to leave her job and to stay at home because he is, statistically speaking, far more likely to make more money than she is. And this is true. The demands of parenthood continue to be the primary driving force behind the gender pay gap. And until we decide to be really serious-minded about how we're going to create actual policies to turn that around, we'll just continue having this conversation in cycles and circles, right? It matters. If we want gender equality to become more than a pipe dream and an actual principle, then you have to have real policies in mind to ensure that that happens. So for practices, here's what I have to say about that. Even if you could eliminate all of those external barriers and obstacles, like pay and time off, the demands of family. I was fortunate enough, for example, to land myself in an organization where many of those were addressed and set aside for me. I landed myself in a place where people were willing to work with me. They valued my presence there enough to let me inform our policies. And so a lot of those things were taken care of. But then you know what I found? Is that after you've dealt with the external obstacles and limitations, really it's the internal obstacles and limitations that are actually the far more challenging and harder to deal with. For example, I grew up in a religious tradition where timidity, female timidity, namely, was praised. Women were praised for being timid and deferential to male authority. So the more accommodating and apologetic you are, the better you are, the stronger you are. It's seen as a strength and an asset. right? And then strangely, sort of wider culture also seemed to corroborate that that was true, because who were the women who most often seemed to clearly ascend the ranks and receive the most attention? Well, those who were able to attract the attention of men, oftentimes using their wiles, as they call them, and not their wits and words, right? You never heard about that, you know? The really witty and clever celebrity internet star. That doesn't happen, you know? Maybe more and more, but less as a kid growing up, and you pay attention to these things and you internalize these messages for about 24 years, right? And then you find yourself in a setting where somebody says to you, I want you to come and sit at this table, and I want you to take initiative, and I want you to lead, and I want you to be confident. Go. And you cannot call that equal opportunity, because every man at that table has been preparing for that moment and that opportunity his entire life. And for so many women sitting at that table, that message sounds to them about as natural as you asking them to stand on their head and to race to the other side of the room. I have a dress on. How could I could never, you know? And then if she hesitates, or if she falters, she isn't naturally as able, you know, to hop on her hands and race across the room, well, then it's easy to look at her and say, well, then she's obviously less capable. It's not maybe, in fact, that she's less capable, but it is most likely true that she's less practiced. That is true. She's less prepared. So what do we do to practice and prepare, not just putting the burden and responsibility on women who are leaders or who would ascend to positions of leadership, but you who bear the happy privilege of being human and people committed to justice? How are you going to use your privilege to call out and cultivate potential through your practices? Maybe 3 suggestions that were game changers for me. People who, in my organization, who are leaders around me, being able and willing to look for potential by looking past insecurity. Look for potential by looking past insecurity. Just because she doesn't raise her hand, and just because she says she doesn't know when you ask her a question, or compete for the promotion, does not mean she does not have something to say and that she is not capable, likely more capable. It's just that she doesn't know or even trust her ability to advocate for herself. Secondly, I would say this: we need to create leadership development opportunities. We need to get real and be honest about the fact that this is a struggle. Whether we want to accept it or not, whether we attribute it to social conditioning or to inherent differences when it comes to our confidence levels, as some studies would suggest, the facts are women are repeatedly less inclined to compete and to showcase their own abilities. And even when given those opportunities, it's like we have these tics, oftentimes, for myself anyway, that were hard to overcome. For example, I needed a development opportunity where I could sit with someone and they could look at me and say, you have to stop apologizing all the time. Why do you say you're sorry when you're not sorry? I don't know, it's like a tic. I laugh at things that aren't funny all the time. I think it's to make people feel better. Stop doing that. Who told you you had to do that? It undermines your authority. Stop apologizing and stop laughing at your own expense. Thirdly, invite women to the table and then treat them as if you need them to be there. Not because somebody told you to do so, but because you have become convinced that diversity actually is quite helpful and useful. This flourishing of all people is in fact a right. There is a major difference between being just tolerated at the table versus needed at the table. And every single person knows the difference. If I am tolerated at a table versus being needed from the table, it changes the way that I engage at that table altogether. I was fortunate enough to have people who were patient enough with me to let me ease into my role at that table. You need to believe in yourself to choose to only work for organizations who are going to afford you the same opportunities. That's the thing. Believe that you are capable and able enough to make that choice. And the rest of you need to believe in the work that you do enough to wait for them. because they matter and the work that you're doing matters and will be better together. And maybe I'll just say this in closing. The recent sort of cultural backlash against sexual harassment, I think is really interesting for a number of reasons. And there's a lot to say about it, obviously. But maybe I'll just say this. For many women, you all who are committed to justice need to know and to assume that for likely many of us, it's a welcomed and frankly well overdue reality. And secondly, this also likely needs to be said. Just because you do not grab women's butts or catcall your colleagues does not mean that you are not a sexist. In the same way that just because you do not say racial slurs and openly malign black people does not mean that you're not a racist. These isms, our racism and our sexism, are what happen as a result. They are symptoms of choosing to believe that privilege is your right rather than your responsibility, is what comes with the territory. So be careful. And after all, I would like to think that the goal is not simply that we not be sexist and that we just not be racist. We want to do justice, which requires a lot more than just simply not being racist or not being sexist. It means that I believe that it is the happy privilege of the human to do justice, which is to defend your right to flourish as a human. That's all I have to say. Amen.